What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 140. I'm the co-host of the show, Kyle Anzalone, joined by the other co-host, Will Porter. Will, how you doing today, buddy?
What's up, Kyle? How you doing, man?
Doing well, Will. It's been a busy week for news, and I gotta say, I don't like, being right all the time because usually I got bad things to say. But we
Yeah.
got some stories today where we were right from the beginning, and we'll get into that. Important stuff to talk about, too, with the FBI and entrapments and all that. So, a lot of important stuff to cover on today's show. Everybody, be sure to share the show. You find it at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle for a full archive of the show. We had the video version of the show up now at Rumble as a new platform, and also, as always, Odyssey and YouTube. It's up everywhere you could listen to audio podcasts. We have social media accounts at Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter. And you could donate to the show at Patreon or Subscribestar. Links to all those are in the show notes page. So just go to any place you listen to the show, and you can find the links to everything else. Nice and easy there. You'll also find the link to our sponsor, Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. And over at Paloma Verde, they have a great selection of CBD products. Usually I'm telling people about how much I like the topicals, but since you're here today, tell people about what you like.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I still have some of the topical that I need to try myself, but my favorite are the soft gels. They pair them with different things. There's one with curcumin that I think helps with like inflammation, but my personal favorite is the melatonin soft gels that helps me with my insomnia and helps you wind down after a long day. That stuff's all great. I also love the high dose oil tincture. That's if you just want like the most raw CBD you can get. That's the best thing. And so if that stuff sounds interesting to you, or if you want to check out their lab results, they have all kinds of educational resources. Definitely do check out PalomaVerdeCBD.com. And if you spend $75 or more, use Peace to get 25% off your order.
All right, let's get into the news. And the first story, as I indicated, is about the alleged kidnapping plot of Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And at the time when we first talked about this, we I definitely went out there and speculated a little bit that possibly a majority of the people involved in this kidnapping plot would be agents or informants of the FBI, and it looks like I was right. I think some people are giving me pretty long odds on that prediction too, because half is quite a lot. But
Yeah.
yeah, this seems to be majority FBI agent push. So, let's get into the news, the big news, which I think was actually published at BuzzFeed. So it's
Yeah.
kind of interesting. BuzzFeed is definitely one of the platforms that's talked most about the threat from white rage, white national terrorism, white right wing extremism, whatever the hell you want to call it. And here they're
Right.
pointing out that, like, oh, maybe this whole, plot with the Michigan governor wasn't so much about white rage rather than the FBI drumming it up.
Yeah, I would say that this does kind of look like we've been vindicated. Like in our early impressions about this story seemed to be correct. Like I know, like when we initially covered this on the show, we were even at the time looking through the original FBI affidavit, and you could even at the time see some pretty suggestive stuff about their use of undercover agents and confidential informants. And we also pointed out too that some of those guys had been, paid pretty large sums of money to go undercover, and it seemed like they had gotten pretty close to the plot itself. However, that original affidavit left out a lot of important details and facts because in that original document, they only mentioned four undercover agents in the plot. I think it was two actual agents and two confidential informants, like random guys they were able to convince to go undercover for them. However, it's since been shown, and you mentioned, yes, it was BuzzFeed who broke this story, that at least 12 informants or agents were part of this plot, and some of them playing very important roles in sort of driving it forward, like sort of like planning it. Um, and I would recommend people go and read. BuzzFeed had like a 10,000 word write up on this, with a lot of details. If people really want to go and see all the weeds of this, I would urge them to read that. It also gets into a lot of other related stuff and gets into some of the personal stories of the people involved. So there's all kinds of details in there. But BuzzFeed was the one to originally figure out that at least 12 undercovers were being used in this sting. And it turns out one of the informants, this was not mentioned in the original criminal complaint, but one of their informants was paid more than $24,000 and given a new car for his role in this plot. I think they had called the car like a witness protection payment or something like that, an expense. And this same informant, this guy who's only been identified as Dan, I think they refer to him as an Iraq War veteran as well. But he would go on to become basically the second in command in this group of alleged kidnapping plotters. These guys who called themselves the Wolverine Watchmen. That was the name of their little group. But apparently this guy rose to prominence in that group as basically like the number two there. And he would help them to set up their meetings, and he would arrange transportation for people to make sure they were there. And he was also said to have prodded the ringleader of the whole plot, Adam Fox, to like sort of advance the plan. And this guy also had worn a wire and collected, hundreds of hours of recordings on these guys. And he was just one of the 12. This Dan guy, though, he did seem to be like one of the closer ones to the plot. He seemed to be helping helping them, get members, recruit specific people into the plot, helping them to, get transportation to the meetings, things like that. There was another Wisconsin-based informant who had been a long-time government informant who did similar things, who helped to sort of arrange like transportation and get people to these meetings.
And at times, funding those kind of things, right? That seems to be maybe an important thing to me. Like if you weren't gonna like go somewhere and then somebody's like, well, I'll pay for the transportation and the room, you're like, okay, I get it. It's kind of like a free vacation. In a way to some people. So it seems to be like they're really incentivizing it. They're paying for some of this stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Like there's like a bunch of different types of expenses that the FBI talks about. There's like some of it is like that 24,000. I think that was straight up just compensation. They were just paying the guy like for his time and for his services. But then I think they paid another couple $1,000s to like reimburse him on money that he had spent while working undercover, which like I don't think they outline all the things money was spent on, but clearly that has to do with, advancing the plot and helping to like, I don't know if it was buying gear or like you said, like, just gas money or something like that. But clearly it was quite a bit because it was in the several thousands of dollars they were reimbursing some of these informants on. And so, yeah, they are paying to like make some of these things happen. There was also another actual FBI agent who apparently had made contact with this group and was going to sell them explosives. But that never actually came to fruition. But it seemed like this was kind of like just a way for them to lure them into doing something even more radical. That was like the next step. Okay, let's get them to buy explosives now. See if we can hit them for terrorism charges or something like that. And it kind of seems to me that's kind of how this entire plot unfolded, that these informants and undercovers very slowly encourage these guys to kind of step by step move this thing forward and get it more and more extreme until the point they're actually talking about, kidnapping the governor and talking about buying night vision goggles and blowing up a bridge and all this stuff. Like, I'm not sure if they even would have talked about blowing up that bridge had they not, came in contact with that guy who said he'd sell them explosives,
Right. Yeah, that seems to be a lot of the problem here, Will, is that, I can imagine you got a group of young men and you had this guy come in who's a veteran and just kind of by the virtue of how we indoctrinate the children of this country, there's a lot of status and, you get special manlyhood points if you're a veteran. And so if the guy who's a veteran is an FBI informant, so he knows that he's not going to, or at least he really believes that he won't be, charged for anything he says and does all of this, he could really puff out his chest and be like, well, boys, we should, go out there and round up that governor then. And yeah. Really, in a way, kind of maybe become almost a role model, mentor for these kind of, role model is maybe the wrong word because of what it gets them into, but like a mentor, right. Somebody with advanced status and the lives of some of these men. And without that happening, they never would have, gone on to do this. And so, that seems to be a real issue. Also, the amount of money the FBI paid the informants. Well, if they had paid them like, $2,000 over the course of 6 months or something like that, well, yeah, that seems like a little bit of money. But at the same time, I don't know if somebody would really start entrapping people for that reason. But if you're giving a guy $24,000, I mean, that's a significant amount of money for a lot of people. Also, I'm guessing that maybe that gets around taxes and stuff like that, since the feds are giving you that money anyways. And, claiming it on your taxes may prove to be like a problem with finding out that you're a paid informant. So you don't have to claim that money or something like that. Could be a really good chunk of money that we're talking about. And what, if you're a person of low morals, then I don't think it's impossible that you think I'm going to entrap some idiots into doing something. And, the FBI is probably telling you, well, you're just helping to flush out like the snakes of our society, right? That's what you're doing. That's why this is so important. You could get people to say some pretty outrageous stuff, especially, your group of guys are sitting down having some beers, you're shooting some guns. talking some crazy stuff. Like, you get that on wire, and basically you just get the guys to hang out, and they say some crazy stuff, and the FBI is paying for you. That sounds like a pretty good deal to me. So.
Yeah, yeah, and in like sort of my impression of these guys too, it's sort of like it does seem like some of them were, or all of them were toying around with some of these ideas, some of this like patriot militia movement stuff, but like maybe they weren't the most serious people ever. Like, I mean, they didn't name their group the Wolverine Watchmen after all. Like the whole thing just sounds kind of larpy and stupid. It just sounds like something that like a bunch of, I think even one of the defense attorneys had said they were a bunch of military wannabes who kind of got together, they do their little training sessions, but like then you have these 12 dudes, these 12 new guys come around who really start goading them into it, who are really talking business. Like who knows what would have happened with this group of wannabes had these 12 informants not, come into their lives and started, encouraging them and starting to, help them put the meetings together and provide transportation, all this kind of stuff. It seemed like they were kind of the glue for this plot.
Right. And that's an important piece to this, I think, Will, is we're talking about 12 people that the FBI had encouraging this plot. Well, we only know, I guess, that a few of them encouraged the plot, but I'm sure all of them were at the very least going along with it. And so, if you're one of the people that doesn't happen to be an FBI agent or informant, and you have all these people around you that are for it, and maybe you do like go and have some conversations with some other people, and you're like, man, doesn't this sound kind of weird? And they're like, nah, it's gonna be great, like we're gonna do this, we're gonna pull it off, it's what we gotta do for our country, it's because we're patriots. Maybe you start to think that you're really crazy, because just everybody around you is so bought into it. Again, it's not like the FBI had like one person who was just sitting in the back of the room at all these meetings. They had several people who were very active, and all these informants who, again, essentially kind of sign off and are going along with it. You're creating a lot of peer pressure that way, especially if, maybe some of these people are. And Will, I guess we should say, too, that the original reason we suspected that this was an FBI entrapment plot was not because, we don't think white people would do something like this. It's because the FBI has used these tactics time and time again against mostly young Muslim males. And, they do this kind of thing where they send in people who would tend to be role models, religious, figures, young women, anybody who's, like an incentive to like, oh yeah, I get to hang around this person, and it encourages them to do some, pretty terrible things. So, well, I don't know what else you have on that line, but, I did want to mention that.
Yeah, there's actually a whole book about the phenomena you just mentioned. A whole book about it by a journalist named Trevor Aronson called "The Terror Factory," about how the FBI. This is a pattern with the FBI, specifically in terrorism cases, where they get some impressionable young guy. I think in some cases even like slightly mentally ill, like kind of autistic kids, to like they lean over and say you love Osama, kid, into this microphone, and they get him on some crazy terrorism case.
Right.
And they
Certainly
portray
people
themselves.
who don't have a lot of friends, social outcast types. And, it doesn't have to be like maybe on the autism spectrum, but just somebody who like is kind of desperate for friends.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And then they'll bust these kids and then portray themselves as these great heroes. Look at the plot we unfoiled, when really it was completely fabricated. And so I don't think there's absolute definitive proof that this nothing would have happened without these agents, but it's really looking like that to me. It fits that pattern very closely.
Yeah. Now, there's a couple of reasons, well, continuing why this story I think is very important, and that all these FBI agents, being involved are important. The first is that I think it should serve as a general warning to people who the government may label being on the right, and I don't think that would necessarily even be limited to like, white people, but a jihadist type, a Black Panther type, watch out, because the government is out there trying to set people up. They need to generate these big headline manufacturing crimes in order to make sure that they kind of keep their status in the American culture, and that means their funding and all the fancy titles and buildings that they get. Well, we gotta build a new FBI building in a new city so we can name it after Robert Mueller or some other director, that kind of stuff going on. But the other thing that I think is really important about this is the timing of the story. This broke in early October of 2020, and so of course it kind of played a role in the election. Joe Biden tweeted about it. That this story involved COVID. Of course, one of the reasons that some of the people, who were not FBI informants who were involved here, just like the kids who are shown videos of the results of the U.S. Foreign policy in like Afghanistan or Pakistan, like look at the drone strike that killed these kids. Don't you want to take revenge? The people here were upset over COVID and the lockdowns that Gretchen Whitmer was enforcing, which was killing a lot of businesses. It had a lot of negative effects on people. It wasn't as serious as her dropping drones on people's houses, but it was destroying lives nonetheless. And that's what, did generate, I guess, some hatred, enough hatred for her, for some people who weren't paid by the FBI to want to at least say and go along to some extent with wanting to kidnap Whitmer. But Biden and others talked about this, is because Trump is so radical and unhinged with his COVID rhetoric. And so how all this played into politics, I know that if I said, two words that start with E and I together here, but it kind of seems like, the FBI was involved in the narrative leading up to the 2020 election. Kind of interesting how that plays out.
Yeah, I mean, like this, if you think about it, this kind of served like a similar role that like the whole January 6th incident did. That like it didn't have quite the reaction, but it was sort of a similar thing that, oh boy, like, these right-wing, domestic terrorists are on the rise and we better watch out for them. And it did spark that kind of like domestic terror crusade that is really coming to its own since January 6th. But it definitely played a similar role as that, I think.
Right. And then one last thing. Well, I think one of the FBI agents involved got arrested for some domestic abuse. So this certainly seems like it may, hamper his credibility come trial.
Yeah, absolutely. I only pretty much read the headline of that. I do know that there was a domestic case with this guy, but I actually don't know all the details there.
Yeah, I don't think a whole lot of the details had come out, Will, but it is interesting here that I don't know the rap sheet of all the people indicted who are alleged to be in the conspiracy plot here, but it seems like the actual violent people were the ones that were paid by the FBI. I don't know if anybody who was indicted in the conspiracy has actually done anything as violent as this FBI agent apparently did to his wife. So that, who should be taking off the streets here and who should we be concerned with? All right, well, should we move on?
Yeah, that's all I had there on the Michigan case.
All right, so let's talk about I guess Cuba first, and then we'll talk about the Havana syndrome stuff. But I did want to take a minute to talk about this terrible tweet the Libertarian Party put out. I feel somewhat obligated as a party member now to speak out against the stupidity of this on the Twitter account. For people who aren't watching, the LP National Party, the verified account, tweet out, "Libertarians stand with the people of Cuba in their effort to throw off the oppressive communist government. Communist is government ownership of human beings and the product of their labor. It has no place in the civilized world. Everybody deserves freedom. Hashtag SOS Cuba." Well, this was unbelievable that it came out of the LP National account. It could have been written by Marco Rubio. There's absolutely nothing in here about the U.S. empire embargo or the fact that the U.S. runs a torture prison on the island. Let's talk about human rights and, human beings that have control over themselves. How about the 39 detainees left at Gitmo? And in fact, I did a advanced search of the Libertarian Party Twitter account for Guantanamo Bay or Gitmo and found that it's been since 2019 that they even bothered to tweet about the torture prison. So, Will, this to me was just like kind of treating out some right-wing establishment crap. There wasn't anything in this tweet that was remotely unique that, again, couldn't have been tweeted out by somebody mainstream in the Republican Party. And I was very disappointed to see it. I don't know if you have any thoughts on it.
Yeah, I saw that the Libertarian Party Mises caucus kind of came up and followed up. They were nice about it. They were very polite, but they said, as an addendum, we think you should lead with non-interventionism or something like that. And I thought that was more on the mark, definitely. Because like I didn't disagree with like, as far as it goes. Sure, I'm not into communism. Communist governments often do abuse their people, but like it's just kind of tone deaf when like I don't know. It's kind of like Dave Smith says, like, giving a stump speech from 2010 or something. It just seems kind of like irrelevant to the current situation on the ground. I don't know. I think they should lead with non-interventionism always. That should always be sort of the libertarian stance, is opposing especially if your government is the global empire, that is sort of your responsibility at all times. Sure, you can mention that, the communist state in Cuba abuses its people, but I think front and center, you always have to put the non-interventionist angle.
Yeah, yep. And then I guess, too, it doesn't seem to me that it should be really the concern of the Libertarian Party of what's going on in Cuba beyond ending the U.S. intervention on the island. And I guess it would be a different story, Will, if the LP was constantly tweeting about ending the embargo and,
Right.
about Guantanamo Bay and general U.S. interventionism in Latin America. But that really doesn't come up that often. I mean, the LP
No.
Twitter account doesn't tweet all that much. And so when it does put out tweets, it's kind of a little bit more significant than somebody like, a Michael Malice who tweets like 40 times a day or something. It
Right.
doesn't put out tweets all the time. And so when they put out something like this, especially with the SOS Cuba, which
Yeah.
is just the straight up like regime changed hashtag, it's like tweeting out Coney 2012 and 2012. Yeah, I don't want those, little girls to die or become sex slaves, but I don't want U.S. troops going to West Africa to find them.
Right.
That kind
Absolutely.
of situation. And this is the LP going along with that narrative is shameful. And like the LP could have a lot better and more important takes to add to this situation rather than again just going along with something any mainstream Republican would have said. And in fact, really
Absolutely.
any establishment centrist Democrat, like if you're like even like Obama level progressives, they want to open up trade with Cuba, but Biden doesn't. So
Right.
yeah. Anyways, well, let's talk about Havana syndrome now, which is the fakest and maybe the stupidest of the current, kind of propaganda plots. And I am putting that up there with like Bountygate, Russiagate. We'll talk about the Navalny poisoning, OPCW accusations, right? All that kind of stuff is out there. But this is up there with the worst of it. So in 2016, 2017, Will, the U.S. had at that time reopened its embassy in Cuba, and then the Trump administration took over. And I think Trump, looking to score political points in Florida, seeing the Cuban exile community living there as wanting a hawkish policy on Cuba, decided to look for reasons to roll back the improvement of relations with Cuba. And one of the ways they did that was they started alleging that the weird, mysterious illnesses were coming down among the diplomats in Cuba. And I believe, Will, we are covering this on Foreign Policy Focus at the time. I'm not
Yeah.
even sure you had been on a show yet, but I had talked about it, and I know we did shows about it in 2017, if not later in the year.
Yeah.
Anyways, people start feeling not well, and the symptoms are very vague, from headaches to they did some CAT scans. They found out that some people maybe had some not brain damage, but just like things going on showing up in the CAT scan. Although they said they could have been caused by other incidents earlier in lives, there was nothing conclusive tying it to it. It just a kind of a vague variety of symptoms that involve like I'm not feeling well, nauseous, almost flu-like kind of things.
Right.
Cold,
Fatigue.
yeah, fatigue. Now they're using the COVID term. Cognitive fatigue, is that what the brain fog
Yeah.
they're coming up with? They're saying that was related. Anyways, they finally captured the noise that people said was causing this, and it turns out that in a this was published in physics.org by two, I think, University of Berkeley scientists
Yeah.
came out, and they did a study and found that these were I believe some kind of short leg crickets. And so this was not in any way a sonic weapon or anything like that. But Will, it not just because this was completely debunked, and the mainstream media really should have attacked the Trump administration for this. Like, look, guys, you really got this one wrong, and put the diplomats back in the embassy. But no, they completely let them go for it, and then they use it in the Russiagate narrative. This is from Alan McCloud at Fair, but what he's doing in this article is he's debunking an article that came out in GQ. It was 9,000 words long, and it alleged in that article that CIA officer who was in Moscow at the time, Mark Polyamor-Popoulos, told the author that he was he was stationed at a hotel in December of 2017, and he was driving his car. He came to an intersection. He said he was struck with strong feelings of head pain, nausea, and dizziness, and his son started screaming and crying in the back seat. He quickly pulled away from the intersection, and it went away. Now, Will, how that story somehow warranted a 9,000 word piece is absolutely baffling. But yeah. Alan McCloud, who does great work either at Fair or Mint Press News, writes in his article that the CIA doesn't believe this guy's story and says that it's not true. And so this is kind of a debunked story at this point. The CIA is saying that, we don't even believe the claim from our own officer. And, you would think, again, this is absolutely dead. The Havana syndrome is a fake thing. Well, nope, actually not. This past week, we found out that they say there's new cases of Havana syndrome reported in Vienna. Now, Will, I wanted to know what the symptoms were. And so I went to NPR to look for the symptoms, and they say they actually don't know anything. And then they cite the case of Mark, the guy with the really long last name, who, I just talked about in Russia as being a case of this. And then the cases in Cuba, which were the crickets. And so they can't even cite the symptoms, the alleged symptoms of the people in Vienna. But it doesn't die there. Well, apparently the CIA is starting a probe. And I think you had this one at RT on this, so I'll let you kind of talk and get into this part. But I mean, are we seriously is our government going to waste time and look into this? And I mean, I can only imagine the kind of propaganda they're going to be able to come up with here in a propaganda case that seems mainly pushed by the mainstream media over even the U.S. own intelligence community.
Yeah, that is definitely how it seems to me, and I think you did a great job just running down just like sort of how much of a fiasco this has been from the crickets. I think the most recent like explanation posited for this is that it's some kind of directed energy weapon. I know that scientific bodies under the U.S. government had done some kind of study and concluded that could be one of the possible explanations, though they didn't explain like how this weapon would work or who, whether they cited no evidence.
And a weapon that's not even known to be in existence.
Exactly. They've not even shown that anyone's even constructed such a weapon, let alone how it would work or how it would produce this crazy range of different symptoms. However, like you said last week, it has been reported that the CIA is putting together a task force to investigate this. And it was actually kind of funny because one of the ways they kind of tried to hype this up, like it seemed like clearly this was a detail that was leaked by the CIA itself. Because they had the guy they tapped to lead this task force is apparently this veteran intelligence officer who had been who was tapped to track down Osama bin Laden. They're presenting this as in we really mean business now because we're getting the bin Laden hunter on there. But I'm not really sure why that would be such a selling point. It took them more than 10 years to get bin Laden. So like you had said, are they really about to waste time investigating this? They might waste 10 more years looking into this if the bin Laden probe is anything to go by. And bin Laden, when they found him, he wasn't in some crazy place. He was just like a couple hours drive east from Tora Bora, the cave complex he escaped from in Afghanistan right after the U.S. invasion. He was in Pakistan, just like not that far away. And if you believe Seymour Hersh's reporting too, the U.S. intelligence didn't even find bin Laden, contrary to the government's own claims. But instead, he says that it was a Pakistani intelligence officer who just walked into the CIA station, just handed them that information. And so, if this is one of the guys who's running this probe into the Havana syndrome, it might be quite some time before we get any answer. And, I saw a lot of people joking that, like, if we do figure it out, it'll be a decade from now and it'll just be some foreigner who comes and hands us the information for free. It's by no work of our own. But I mean, yeah, this whole Havana syndrome thing, it seems like it is largely just like a propaganda exercise. I mean, there has been some sort of insinuation that like foreign states are behind this, like you had mentioned the CIA guy in Russia,
Or China.
and I think right, or China, or I think Cuba itself too. And I know that some anonymous U.S. officials have come forward, or not come forward, but have slinking around in the shadows, told certain media outlets. I think it was the New York Magazine or something, or the New Yorker, where they had said, top U.S. officials believe in private that the Russians are responsible for this, but they never cite any evidence whatsoever. And the whole thing is just ridiculous. Like, the directed energy hypothesis has zero backing to it. But sort of this is like, I'm not even sure how this made it this far, this narrative, to where now there's a CIA probe. There's also a separate State Department probe they announced in March, where a former ambassador is leading that. And so they are very much taking this seriously, it seems, with all these probes and investigations. But so far as I can see, there's really no leads on it at all. It's really not clear what is, like, I don't claim to know what's happening to these diplomats or whether they really are experiencing symptoms. You and I were talking off air about, like, you're in a foreign country sometimes, maybe your allergies are acting up or something, and people convince themselves that something's happening to them. I know that, like, the Guardian interviewed some neuroscientists who said that, like, maybe this is some form of mass hysteria or something, or some kind of, like, I don't know, placebo, or some kind of psychosomatic is the word I'm looking for, kind of condition, that it's not caused by some advanced super weapon, but it's more of a psychological thing.
Right. Maybe you're eating food in a different country. Maybe it's prepared a different way. The environment, the allergies. There's so much that's going to be different. The elevation, the kind of water you're drinking, the quality of water, how close you are to the ocean. All these things could affect your body a little bit differently. And it doesn't seem like there's a set of symptoms that are consistent here. It's not like everybody is sitting at a intersection, feels something, and then feels better instantly later. Some of these people say they feel terrible for long periods of time. There's all kinds of a different range of symptoms, that it could just be that if 60 people are in a room and everybody's like, oh man, I've been feeling bad and kind of tired lately, and people are like, oh, I don't know if I've been feeling great myself. And even though their symptoms don't line up, they kind of all start to believe that they have the same thing going on. And then when the mainstream media and stuff will confirm it, well, I'm sure that really adds to the whole confirmation bias kind of right. Group hive mind kind of psychosomatic issue, right, that you could run into. Anyways, I mean, like, from a psychological standpoint, I'm sure in 100 years, when the American empire doesn't like rule all the studies going on, somebody will be able to do some really cool like investigation into how all this happened, and people continue to put forward, years later, serious journalists, the Biden administration, the FBI is continuing to march forward with this, especially when it seems like it should be treated something like the chemical weapons in Syria, where the Biden administration could be like, look, the Trump administration was acting completely out of line. They tried to bully the OPCW to cover up the airstrikes against that country that they shouldn't have carried out, and we're not going to continue with this policy, but rather the Biden administration is pushing it forward. But if we're all done on this, I know we have an important story to talk about with Alexei Navalny and the alleged chemical weapons poisoning that he was the victim of.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so Will, this is, I mean, it's such an interesting story, and there seems to really be so little evidence for it. A lot of, the conspiracy was laid out by, what was the name? Bellingcat put
Yes.
out like a big timeline, and in there, like, I read it, and they, I think, lay out a pretty decent timeline. I couldn't pick it apart really and say like, oh, this doesn't seem to be true. And they do rely a lot on this phone call made after by Alexei Navalny to one of the alleged people who poisoned him, potentially poisoned his underpants. I mean, and the guy like seems to admit in the phone call that he did it, although I never understood why the guy just didn't hang up. I mean, maybe, it's social situation, like people who, especially this is a rather incompetent member, it's possible, but will, the whole thing sounds kind of outrageous. And now you're finding some inconsistencies in the allegations, so let's dive into it.
Yeah, sure, sure. So, I think we've covered Alexei Navalny in the past a little bit. This Russian opposition figure who's allegedly poisoned in Siberia last year. I can just briefly kind of summarize what was said to have happened to him. He got sick on a plane that was headed for Moscow. He was actually in flight, and it ended up having to make an emergency landing in another Siberian city where he ended up being hospitalized on, I think, August 20th. And pretty much immediately, Navalny's own people have been claiming that he was definitely poisoned by the Russian government. And by August 22nd, he was flown to a hospital in Germany to be treated. A few days after that, he had been there. The German government then said they had confirmed that he was poisoned with a nerve agent resembling Novichok, which people might recall played a major role in the whole Sergei Skripal case in the UK in 2018. So that's basically just like the shortest version of the story possible. Germany and a bunch of other Western countries are insisting that Navalny was poisoned by the Russians. They're demanding Putin fesses up to it. I think the U.S. and the EU and maybe even others by now have imposed sanctions over this. So it has had some like geopolitical consequences beyond just the poisoning itself or him getting sick itself. And I will say right up front too, like I don't claim to know what happened to this guy here. Like I don't completely reject the possibility that maybe he was poisoned by some FSB agents or something. He is a big Putin critic, and I guess he was kind of an annoyance to the government over there. I don't think he's ever really been a serious threat to the state there or any kind of serious opposition figure with a lot of popular support. But still, governments do evil things, and the Russian government is no exception to that. However, we have just seen a lot of very weird and fishy things with this whole case, very much like we saw with the Skripal scandal, things that just kind of don't add up, and there's holes and consistencies in the story. And also, when you kind of consider the incentive for NATO states like Germany and the U.S. to accuse Russia of things like this, as we've seen in other cases in the last couple of years, I think there is some room to be skeptical about this entire story. And so with that said, yeah, let's get into the latest kind of weird anomaly in this whole story. And there are other ones I'd like to run down too, but we can start with the most recent. So earlier this month, the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, put out this report sort of summarizing some of their recent activities. And the document is actually kind of boring and mundane in most ways. Like there's really not that much that's interesting about it. However, in the section on Navalny, it suddenly changes up the timeline for the story in a way that really raises a lot of questions. So Navalny got sick on August 20th in Russia, and he wasn't admitted to the German hospital until August 22nd, 2 days later. And the OPCW had previously said that German officials had requested help from the OPCW, like to send a technical team on September 4th. And so that would mean the Germans contacted this the chemical watchdog like quite a few days after he had arrived in Germany, which would kind of make sense. You know, they do some of their own tests. They look at him and go, geez, it looks like maybe this guy was poisoned with something. Let's call in the experts. However, now in this new document, and people can see it on the screen, the old and the new versions of the story from the OPCW, they say they deployed their team to Germany on August 20th, which is very strange because Navalny wasn't even in Germany at that point. German doctors had not done any tests on him. There's really no strong reason to believe that a chemical weapon was used at that point. And so it's very odd that they would be calling in the chemical weapons watchdog just instantly, right away. And if this really is the correct date, if August 20th it was the date that they deployed their team, it would suggest to me that the Germans had already kind of made up their mind about what happened before they had even collected a shred of evidence. Like they would have had to call up the OPCW immediately within minutes or hours of the reports of Navalny being sick on this airplane, at which point it wouldn't have been clear at all what had happened to him. And so the fact that go ahead.
And just for the purposes of the timeline, Will, this was before he was on the plane to Germany, right? I guess, was there any reason to suggest that he would go to Germany right away? I mean, there's several countries that would have been closer that would have been in the NATO orbit, Poland and the Baltic states. So that's I guess what's suspicious to me.
Yeah, that is also. I think there are some like sort of gaps in the story because I believe like Angela Merkel publicly offered assistance like after there had been reports that this guy was sick that, oh, we have a hospital you can come here for. But I am kind of curious like exactly how that happened. Was that just she extended that offer publicly, or was she like sort of communicating, or her people, her staffers communicating with Navalny's people behind the scenes somehow? And like sort of that's what led up to her public offer of help. Like I think that stuff is still kind of not clear. But regardless, if they indeed had requested help on August 20th before Navalny was even in their country at all, that would seem very hasty to me. Like, even let's just say that they had been in touch with Navalny's people somewhat, and hey, it looks like he might have been poisoned or something. The fact that they would call in the OPCW before they even looked at him, like, again, that just seems they're a little bit too eager to have this be a chemical weapons poisoning kind of story. And in the German government's own statements on this, they do say that they ran tests on Navalny like sometime in his first few days at the hospital in Berlin. And they said that they had therefore, quote unquote, requested help from the OPCW afterward. But it appears that sort of sequence of events is misleading and that they had actually already called the OPCW in before they had even looked at Navalny at all. So I think that is sort of like that's basically what I had on this newest piece to the story. And sort of on its own, like, it doesn't prove a whole lot. Like, it does, I think, raise some pretty big questions about, why the Germans decided to do what they did when they did, and why did the OPCW's timeline for this suddenly change. The Russians, I know, have noticed this, and they are demanding that somebody explain it, like what's going on with this timeline that's changing and that's raising some very strange questions. But I don't think they've given any answers yet, the Germans or the OPCW. But I'll let you jump in real quick if you have anything else to say. But there's other stuff. There's a lot of other discrepancies that, in addition to this, like make it look very fishy.
Yeah, well, I guess one thing I just want to remind people is that the U.S. Has sanctioned this Alexei Navalny or sanctioned Russia on behalf of this Alexei Navalny figure, who was had his prisoner of conscience status revoked by Amnesty International because he has made unrepentant calls for violence. And a lot of this we are kind of, I think, taking somewhat on the word of Alexei Navalny, or at least he's alleging that this team has been following around for a long time and stuff. And we should realize that this is like a Richard Spencer or Chris Cantwell type figure. He's a white nationalist type, and so
Right.
not necessarily that means anybody shouldn't trust his word, but it's very interesting that there's so much sympathy paid to him by the U.S. mainstream media when he has some pretty repulsive political views, and I think is a little bit more of a fringe figure than they like to portray him as. So, let's get into some of those other inconsistencies.
Yeah, sure. And that is absolutely right. I think like his status as an opposition figure in Russia is often hyped up in Western press. And that if you actually talk to Russians, like it's like some people haven't really heard of this guy. It's kind of a similar situation with Juan Guaido in Venezuela. Like you talk to some Venezuelans, they're like, I don't really know who this guy is. But in the Western media, it's as if he's some like, heroic freedom fighter that everybody, he's a national hero for his people or something. But yeah, anyway, just sort of to swing back to some of these more like there's been a lot of inconsistencies in this whole story. Like the initial Russian poisoning claim came from Navalny's own staffers. They were the first to put this idea out there, and they had done so within like moments of the story breaking. But since it first came out, it's changed around quite a bit. So first they had said that he had tea at the airport, and that this had to have been what was poisoned because he hadn't eaten or drinking anything else that day. And so like it seemed like, oh, this is the obvious culprit of how he was poisoned. And I think we mentioned this when it first happened too, but like they just happened to capture a photo of him while he was sipping that very cup of tea, which made for this like ideal visual when the story was first breaking. I always found that to be a little like just a little too perfect. I don't know, but that's neither here nor there.
And
maybe
for I think for a little bit more context too, Russia is at least alleged to put some kind of like nuclear material in somebody's coffee at one point. I think to
like
to
polonium.
kill. Yeah, polonium. Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that people are pretty convinced Russia was behind that. But that it just kind of fits in with that narrative, I think.
Yeah, it just seemed like just a little too perfect. Like everything fell into place like that. But I'm not drawing any too intense conclusions from that. I just thought it looked kind of odd. However, a few weeks later, after this story initially happens and Navalny gets sick, his people then changed the story and they said, and this is probably the weirdest part of the whole thing. And they say a water bottle in his hotel room had been poisoned, and they claimed that a German lab had confirmed the presence of a nerve agent on the bottle. And they had originally made this claim in a very weird venue on Instagram, in an Instagram little post and video. That's where this originated. And that was picked up in every major Western media outlet everywhere. But then it's very strange because ever since then, it's basically never been mentioned again. The German government never confirmed anything about a water bottle, nor did the OPCW or anybody else. Like, as far as I can tell, this detail was solely sourced to Navalny's own aides and staffers. And then it just disappeared, despite it supposedly having been confirmed by a German government laboratory. And you'll notice, too, in all the Western media coverage of this, they just cite Navalny's aides and just take their word for it. Like, they hardly even attempt to verify it beyond that. At the time, it did seem like, oh wow, it's some damning new piece of evidence, and it just kind of there's no follow up. It just kind of goes away. And so I just find that very odd. Like there was one other thing that was mentioned afterward, but it certainly doesn't make the story any more convincing. Because later on, one of his staffers, this guy named Georgy Albarov, had claimed that the bottle probably was not the source of the poison, and that Navalny must have somehow transferred this nerve agent from his mouth onto the bottle. And like, I mean, I'm no weapons expert, but that seems utterly implausible to me, to say the least. That like he contaminated the bottle with his mouth. Like, how long ago would he have been poisoned? How long is he walking around with this like crazy lethal nerve agent, apparently Novichok, in his mouth? Like, how long did it just the whole thing seems very strange.
Right.
So the whole like mystery water bottle situation doesn't add up at all. And to me, it kind of says that Navalny's people maybe aren't credible in their claims. Like they said this was verified by a government lab, but like that appears that's not the case. And so like I don't like how much else are we going to take them seriously on if they're going to fabricate something as serious as that. Right. However, again in December of last year, the story changed again and became even more ridiculous. And you had mentioned that like big long Bellingcat investigation they did, where they claimed to have identified the FSB agents involved in the poisoning and all this. I honestly found a lot of that very questionable. The FSB stuff, it just seemed like a little Hollywood-like and cartoonish. And even in that investigation, they had Navalny go undercover and speak to these alleged agents on the phone personally, which that part also seemed a little weird. But in one of those calls, that's where the guy says that he put poison on Navalny's underwear, that he smeared it on there, and that's how it happened, apparently. And as far as I know, that's sort of like the latest version of the story. That's like the latest claim, the latest iteration of it, where it started at the T at the airport, and now it's they smeared it in his underpants. And actually, I don't even think that part made it into Bellingcat's article. I think it's only in the actual like audio, because I went through and looked through the investigation. I couldn't find anything about the underwear. But other people did then pick that up. You know, our favorite Russia kook truther at The Guardian, Luke Harding, he covered that for that outlet. They all seemed to take it very seriously about the underpants. But, you know, I just found that to be sort of like the culmination of the ridiculous, like, changing story here. And then to top all this off, too, there's also the fact that Navalny, this is not the first time he's claimed he's been poisoned and, like, tried to turn it into this big, like, PR stunt and controversy. You know, like, I guess it's possible he was right about the last time he claimed it, too. I think he was in jail at the time. But, like, what? Like, the Russians just somehow can't kill this guy? Like, despite using these lethal nerve agents like Novichok, they've had every opportunity to do this for years. And yet they're now 2 for 2 in failing to, like, they poisoned him but couldn't kill him. And then you also have, you know, Sergei Skripal, who is said to have been poisoned by this stuff. Just, I don't know. A lot of this stuff just kind of doesn't seem to add up to me. I don't know what happened to this dude. I don't know how he fell ill, or maybe someone else did poison him. I certainly don't support the Russians necessarily throwing him in jail for trying to, like, organize protests and stuff. Like, I'm not for that. But the whole poisoning narrative just has tons of red flags. And it really, I think, fits in with other questionable things we've seen recently, like the Skripal case, like the OPCW's work in Duma in Syria. Like, there's just parallels here that I think are hard to ignore in this case.
Right. Yeah, and I guess the last thing I'll add, Will, is it seems odd to me that Russia would have this alleged super deadly chemical weapon, Novichok, and they used it on Sergei Skripal, an older man in the UK, and it didn't kill him, and then they used it again against Navalny, and it still didn't kill him. And I mean, it just seems like kind of an odd thing to try twice. But let's move on. And Will, can you tell us about the updates in the past week in Haiti? I know last week on the show when we talked, I'm not sure if it was when I talked to you or Patrick McFarlane, but we mentioned that the U.S. was now backing a different guy in Haiti, and boy, wouldn't you know it, a couple days later, the new guy ends up being the leader.
Yeah, that's correct, and that was me on the show when we talked about that last. That there had been sort of some uncertainty, there had been dispute over who ought to be in charge in Haiti after the assassination of the President Moise. This guy Claude Joseph had become the acting PM and president after the assassination. And initially, the U.S. and the UN, the U.S. State Department, had come out and backed Joseph, said that he should lead until the next election. But then, as I explained last week, they then kind of flip-flopped, and that the U.S., the UN, a bunch of Western countries suddenly switched their support over to Joseph's rival, this guy Ariel Henry, who had actually been tapped to be the PM by Moise just a couple days before he was killed. So that was kind of surprising, this like abruptly flip-flopping over to this other guy, especially at a time in Haiti when there's a lot of like instability and fears there could be unrest, that they just did that. It was kind of a shock. However, within less than a week of this flip flop, Claude Joseph comes out and says that he's going to resign and that he's going to let this Henri guy take over. So this is kind of a big deal. And like, I don't know for a fact that we can say that Joseph was straight up ousted from power under international pressure, but it certainly kind of has that look to it that like, that we kind of stepped in and put our hands in the scales and said, this other guy should be in charge. And within days, this guy is in charge. So it does kind of seem like that's kind of how we've, we're remaining involved in Haiti, whether directly or indirectly. And in fact, it seems like there was another way we've been indirectly involved as well. That's basically all I had on the transfer of power. It's sort of abrupt. Right. It was kind of a surprise. However, last week, the Pentagon also had some comments that I think are worth mentioning here. So the DOD had previously acknowledged that some of Moise's assassins had received U.S. training. Most of the gunmen were Colombian mercenaries. Many of them had served in the Colombian military previously, which has pretty close ties with Washington. But last week, the Pentagon has now confirmed that at least 7 of the assassins were trained by the U.S. in the past while serving in Colombia's military. It was on counter-narcotics training and small unit leadership training and a few other kind of basic-sounding things. Of course, the Pentagon is insisting that this training has no connection to the president's murder. And I mean, I wouldn't claim that it had a direct link to it, but I think it is kind of interesting just how often this kind of stuff happens. Like, how these foreign fighters get U.S. training and then they go on to stage coups and assassinations later. I know we've talked about Mali on the show before. Just in the last year there have actually been 2 coups d'etats by a U.S. trained military officer, that guy Assimi Goïta. In Africa overall, since 2008, I think there have been 7 coups by U.S. trained militants. And that's just recently. If you look like going back to like the 70s, there's been research showing that I think between 1970 and 2009, American trained militants led no less than 165 coup attempts worldwide. And that was just looking at 2 specific training programs. That's not even counting like the School of the Americas, or the other covert training, the stuff that NED and the IRI does with State Department money, these soft power orgs like training up coup plotters. So like taking all that stuff into consideration, this claim that, our training had nothing to do with the assassination, like that rings a little bit hollow to me. That I think like when you're constantly involved in other people's business, when you're constantly picking winners and losers all around the world, handing them weapons, handing them military know-how, that sooner or later, you're going to end up with people who then later lead coups and assassinations and commit atrocities and do things like that. And you are, I think, partially responsible for that.
Yep, absolutely. Well, anything else on Haiti before we wrap here?
No, that was pretty much it. Those 2 major updates: the abrupt change of power and the U.S. fessing up to backing these 7 assassins.
All right, everybody. Well, thanks for tuning into the show again. The show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle for the full archive and the daily news roundup that I write. Social media accounts, Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter. Video platforms, Rumble, new out, all the episodes up there. So far, all the videos will have been monetized and no fleds or anything like that. Somebody said it was a little bit of a Boomer Con kind of scene over there, but so far they haven't banned any of our stuff, including the Palestine Has a Right to Defend Itself episode, so that's been good to see. So we'll continue to post episodes there. I got a couple of subscribers, a couple of people watching. If you want us to put the show up somewhere, let me know, but also be sure to share and recommend the show on that platform, because if nobody watches it somewhere, then we won't have the show up there. And let's see, then donate to the show, Patreon, Subscribestar. Crypto addresses are in the show notes page. Will is at The Will Porter on Twitter. I'm at Kyle Andalone _. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, everybody. See you.